Here because you want to hear about interpreting the Constitution, but I really, really want to talk about potato cheesecake. And on this incredibly long handout that you have, the first thing on it is a recipe for potato cheesecake that I pulled off of a website of 18th century recipes. If you don't have it, you're not missing all that much. With only one comma, it says something like, to a 1/4 pound potatoes boiled, skinned, and beaten in a mortar, add a 1/4 pound of sugar and a 1/4 of butter. 1/4 of what? It doesn't say. 2 eggs, leaving out the whites of 1, the juice of a lemon, and the peel of a 1/2 a 1 grated sweetmeats and currants, if you like it. Then add a glass of mountain or any sweet wine, bake them with a puff paste round the tins. And the question I want to explore is, how would one understand what that means? Now, the logically prior question is, why would anyone want to understand what that means? And that's actually a very profound question. It's off my topic a bit, but it's worth emphasizing. One of Ayn Rand's many underappreciated observations is that cognition is costly. It's costly in 2 senses of the term. It requires energy and effort to focus and to select an object of focus. And in economic terms, there's an opportunity cost to any decision to focus. Cognitive energy devoted to one task is of energy that's not available for others. So it's always a question, is it worth knowing something? It may be, in the case of our recipe for potato cheesecake, that the answer is no, it's not worth any cognitive energy, and it's a complete waste of all of our time. But there are a number of reasons why, in some contexts, this may not even be it. In some contexts, it might be worth trying to understand what this document says. One might simply have intellectual curiosity about it. One of the great advantages of an industrial society, at least until it gets destroyed, is that people have the leisure to think about things like potato cheesecake instead of where the next meal is going to come from. One just might want to know things. You might be writing a book on the history of 18th century cooking. It would be useful to know. One might also have a normative theory that says, follow the next recipe for potato cheesecake that you come across. You may have some pre-commitment based on some theory of normativity that says, whatever this recipe is, this is a guide for action. Not off the top of my head obvious what that moral theory would be, but it could happen. Third, on the same lines, you might have a moral theory that says, you might want to think about this as a candidate for action. Maybe you won't do anything with this recipe once you understand it, but it might be worth thinking about. Now, for all of those tasks, what they have in common is that it's essential to understand what the document means. There are differences in terms of the consequences or implications of knowing what it means. For some of those reasons, but not others, courses of action follow from what you learn. Right? But whether or not courses of action follow is independent of what the document means. The document doesn't care what you do with it. Right? The document's meaning does not change depending upon what you plan to do with it. The document means what it means, right? That's why on the outline it says that understanding the document is conceptually separate from doing anything with it. Absolutely fundamental. We'll get to that shortly. All right, so just putting aside what, if anything, we're going to do with this document, how would we understand its meaning? And the first thing we observe is that it's a document. And by that we mean it is the product of a conscious mind. If instead we were dealing with a phenomenon that was the result of millions of years of being carved into the side of a rock by the forces of nature, we'd be having a very different talk. Would be talking about randomness, infinite monkeys, that sort of thing. We wouldn't be talking about meaning and interpretation. To talk about meaning and interpretation presupposes that we're dealing with something that is the product of a conscious mind. And it is the product of a conscious mind that uses words. Now, words are representations of concepts. Concepts we're going to hear more about today, I gather, in another presentation. But it's here that the objectivist epistemology comes into play as an essential guide to understanding potato cheesecake. Concepts are cognitive tools. They are ways of organizing an otherwise unruly and unmanageable universe. They identify existence, they distinguish them, and then integrate them into cognitive units. The word then serves as a perceptual reminder, a cognitive shorthand for what the concept is. And what that concept is, its referents, the things to which it refers, are the things, the events, the relations, those aspects of the world that have been distinguished and then integrated. So because this document consists of words, its meaning ultimately reduces to the things, events, relations in the world to which it refers. How would we determine what those things, events, and relations are? And to answer that question requires something that really ought to be the subject not just of another talk, but a whole other conference, and that is the philosophy of language. Now, those who are long associated with the theory of objectivism can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I have always thought that the philosophy of language was relatively underdeveloped within objectivist theory. Language has two functions, one of which Ayn Rand emphasized, one of which she didn't. The function that she emphasized, and it's a valuable emphasis because it's largely neglected outside of objectivist circles, is an epistemological function of language. And by that we mean language, by turning concepts into percepts, serves as an essential cognitive tool for understanding the universe. In that sense, language is essential even for a person on a desert island, right? It's an important way. There was a movie several decades ago with Jodie Foster where she was raised in a swamp and wound up inventing her own language. Well, that was a cognitively essential thing to do. Words, as Rand says, turn concepts into perceptual concretes and thus complete the process of concept formation. What's important on that score is that how concepts are formed is not necessarily invariant across persons. Very important. The world is invariant across persons. What exists is invariant across persons. How one cognitively organizes that is not. There are reasons why Eskimos have several dozen words for snow, and Brazilians and Nigerians do not. The way that it makes sense to organize the world depends on the cognitive context in which you find yourself, right? So once we've identified that we're dealing with words, concepts, reference, yes, there's some things out there in the world to which those words and concepts refer. You need to know the conceptual scheme of the conscious mind that formed them in order to understand what those references are. More on that shortly. The second function that language serves, and it's actually distinct but related to the first, is communication. Language serves as a tool for communicating with yourself across time, your present self, your future self, and so forth. For movie fans of Christopher Nolan, think about Memento, right, where the person is communicating with himself across time. But it's also a device for communicating with other conscious minds, right? Now, those two functions are related. They are not identical. In any given cognitive context, there are going to be better and worse ways of organizing reality, depending upon the cognitive needs that you have. The best way to organize the world for your own cognitive purposes, for the organizational structure of your own mind and the conduct of your own actions, is not necessarily going to be the best way of communicating with other people. If the other people are similarly situated to you, there's going to be substantial overlap, but they're not exactly the same thing. So the enterprise of communication with other people is not quite exactly the same thing as the enterprise of communicating with yourself. What does anything of this have to do with potato cheesecake, and what does any of this have to do with the Constitution? Well, to the extent that we are dealing with the product of a conscious mind using language, we know we're dealing with an exercise in communication. Either a conscious mind trying to communicate with itself, or a conscious mind trying to communicate to other conscious minds. What that means is that when faced with something that you know is an act of communication, how would you understand it? Well, one would think one would be trying to understand what the person communicating was trying to communicate. That seems pretty simple. It is pretty simple, right? It's untold chaos comes from overlooking that very simple observation. Now, if you are faced with something that you know is an act of communication, there are any number of things you can do with it. You could ignore it because the cognitive costs are too high. You could decide that you want to improve upon it. You could decide that you want to play word games with it, rearrange the letters, all sorts of interesting things you can do with communications. But to the extent that you want to understand it, the only way to do that is to try to figure out what things, events, and relations in the world the person who was communicating was referring to. What were the references that the communicator had in mind? Once you see that, the default mode of understanding communication becomes something that, and I have not introduced the concept of law yet, so don't read anything into it, an epistemology of original intentions. What is it that the communicator was intending to communicate? If you aren't trying to figure that out, you are not engaged in the enterprise of communication, interpretation, or understanding. You may very well be engaged in other enterprises. Those other enterprises may well be very important. In some contexts, they may be more important than the enterprise of communication, interpretation, or understanding. But they won't be those enterprises. Communication, interpretation, understanding requires that you try to understand what the person communicating was trying to communicate. And under number 15 on your fancy schmancy handout, I have some sort of technical citations trying to explain that a little bit more. Well, wait a minute. Why should we care what someone else is trying? Well, again, that's a different question. Maybe you don't care what the other person is trying to communicate. What if we can come up with a better meaning, normatively better meaning than the person? Great. Maybe you can. It's entirely possible to attribute meanings to things that other people have said that in many ways are better than what the person said. But what you're doing in that circumstance is creating a meaning, not ascertaining, understanding, or interpreting it. To quote myself, one can certainly give meaning to words independently of the context in which they were uttered or written, just as one can give meaning to spilled goat entrails or a random collection of star patterns, but then one is giving rather than ascertaining meaning. Now, it's quite possible that what the communicator intended, what the things, events, and relations in the world to which the communicator meant to refer, were precisely what someone reading the words would understand them to mean. That's a perfectly plausible communicative intention, right? And in a lot of context, it's a perfectly sensible one. I'm not here talking to myself. At least I hope not, right? I'm here talking to other people. So what I am trying to do, whether I'm succeeding or not, I'm sure you'll let me and William Thomas and David Kelly know. What I'm trying to do is communicate information, and to do that, I'm using words that I am assuming you will understand. So in some sense, my intention is to use those words not to convey some private thoughts in my head, but to project or predict what it is that will end up in yours. So there's a sense in which the original intention of a communicator can be a public act. Quite often that's going to be true. So with all of that as background, what can we actually say about our document? To what things, events, and relations in the world was the author of our recipe for potato cheesecake referring? Well, I've been assuming that it's a recipe. It certainly looks like a recipe. What happens if it turns out that it isn't really a recipe, that this was actually a coded message being sent to, British troops somewhere in New York, closing in on Saratoga, and if you actually applied the code and you get the Turing machine and go ching, 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 and at the end of the day it says, beware, you're about to get hammered by Washington's troops. If we know that it's a code, that obviously affects the way we understand the meaning of the words. We wouldn't be looking at ordinary conventional language meanings. We'd be looking for something subtler. Suppose we knew it was a poem, that the person was not actually trying to describe how to make potato cheesecake, but was trying to convey images or instill certain emotions. What kind of document you have in front of you determines to some extent how you understand it. And again, this gets into issues in the philosophy of language that we can only scratch on here. Language is a very complex institution. It's a complex institution both in its epistemological function and in its social communicative function. Anytime you're engaged in communication, you have to take a great many things for granted about the abilities and understandings of those to whom you are communicating. You could not, even if you wanted to, lay out all of the interpretative rules that are going to govern what it is that you're saying. I could have, part of my handout list, by the way, when I'm talking, assume that I'm talking in standard English. What I mean by standard English is that I could give you a whole set of interpretative conventions for understanding what I'm saying. But even if I tried to do that, I couldn't possibly get them all. But since you understand that this is a lecture/discussion, that already triggers you. It's not a poetry reading, right? It's not a code, not calling people to arms. And so when you're trying to understand what I'm saying, the conventions, background understandings, tacit assumptions that you're making about what is going on in this exercise in communication help you govern and understand what I'm saying. If it was a poetry reading, you'd come with very different expectations. So how you interpret a document depends in large measure on what kind of document it is. Now, I think we can safely assume this one is a recipe. I don't know that with absolute unconditional certainty, but there's certainly no context-specific evidence suggesting otherwise, so any claim that it's a poem would be an arbitrary proposition, and that's not worth cognitive energy. It also would help to know the author, right? How you understand a communication depends to some extent on who is doing the communicating. If you're dealing with your 3-year-old child, you're going to have a different set of interpretative conventions than if you're dealing with your 23-year-old, one hopes, dealing with your 23-year-old child. So knowing things about the author tell you what? They tell you something about the conceptual schema of the author. Because how the author organizes the world and then translates that organization into concepts and then words depends upon the cognitive context of the author. So knowing things about the author can help you in many settings understand what the author was saying. We don't know much of anything about this particular author. We do have good reason, or so I trust the website on this, to think that it was an 18th century document. That does have some implications. We see the word sweetmeats showing up in this. It's not honey-baked ham. It's candied fruit. Even though if somebody uttered it today, could well mean honey-baked ham. Who knows? So knowing the temporal setting in which the words came out also tells you something about the conceptual scheme. So all of those things are important for understanding what the document is trying to communicate. Now we come to a different set of problems. The document contains a mix of terms. Some of them are numerical quantities, things like 1/4 and 1/2. I think we can safely assume those meant the same thing in the 18th century as they mean today. Also refers to certain entities in the world, things like butter, eggs, sugar, currants, wine, pastry. Now here's the thing about concepts. Concepts mean the things to which they refer. All the things to which they refer, not just the specific things you have in mind. If you see 12 tigers and come up with the concept of tiger, that includes not just those 12 tigers, but also any other tigers that may come along. Now, it's possible, and sometimes may even be useful, to come up with a concept of those 12 tigers. It's not at all impossible that that would be a useful cognitive thing to have, right? It's even possible in a particular context that what someone is attempting to communicate by the word tiger is just those 12 tigers and no more. But the normal default is that because something is a concept, it includes all of the things to which it refers, past, present, future, known and unknown. What we know as butter and sugar today may actually be very different in its chemical composition, in its qualities, in its taste, in its texture, than what someone in the 18th century would have understood by butter and sugar. So when the person who wrote this recipe talked about things like butter and sugar, they may have had very concrete, specific things in mind. If they could fast forward 2 centuries and see what today we call butter, or parquet, or sugar, it's quite possible that they would have written very different quantities than they did. In other words, 1/4 pound of 1783 butter may be a very different thing than a 1/4 pound of 2015 butter. So if someone was really writing a recipe based on modern butter, they wouldn't say 1/4 pound, they'd say 1/8 of a pound. Could very well be, right? But in terms of understanding what the person who wrote this recipe had in mind, what they communicated was a 1/4 pound of butter, not 1/8 of a pound of butter. It's possible to communicate whatever quantity of butter makes for a good recipe. There's actually a reference in here to, sweetmeats and currants if you like it. Paste round the tins. There are things that are designed to be non-specific quantities, right? Where you can fill in the blanks as you will. But 1/4 pound of butter means 1/4 pound of butter. Now, if you actually sat down to make this recipe, and you made it with 1/4 pound of butter, and the butter that you're making it with is different than 18th century butter, might you wind up with a crappy recipe? Sure. Could you come up with a better recipe by changing the quantity? Could be. But you'd be changing the recipe. You wouldn't be interpreting or understanding the recipe, right? Remember, what you do with it is different from what it means. If you want to know what it means, and you have to know what it means before you can decide whether you can improve upon it, you have to figure out what it is that the person communicating was trying to convey. Same thing with the 1/2, the 1/4 of butter. It doesn't say, I said 1/4 pound of butter. I've been assuming that. It just says 1/4 of butter. It doesn't say 1/4 of what. How are you going to fill in that blank? Well, there are lots of ways to fill in that blank. One would be, what would make the morally best recipe? Another would be, what was the author trying to convey? Again, if you're trying to understand the recipe and not necessarily use it as a guidance for your action, it's got to be what the person was trying to convey. That's what communication is all about. All right, so half an hour into a talk. What does any of this have to do with the United States Constitution? I think the answer is almost everything. What kind of document is the United States Constitution? It's not a poem. It's not a code. It's been called a great many things. I've given a couple of examples of what it's been called in here. Some of them I couldn't have made up even if I wanted to, right? It's been called a treaty. It's been called a contract. It's been called pretty much everything you could ever come up with. My all-time favorite, this is from Peggy Radin, a major legal thinker, a reflection of the tension between our understanding of our present state and our understanding of social ideals toward which progress is possible. All right. Looks like a recipe to me. Looks a lot like a recipe for assembling a particular kind of government. Why do we care? Well, because that brings into play the background principles for interpretation that belong to recipes, as opposed to the background principles of interpretation that belong to poems or sermons or codes or anything else. Okay? So how are we going to understand the things, events, and relations in the world to which this recipe was referring? And here is where, just like trying to understand what an 18th century author of a potato cheesecake recipe was trying to convey, if you want to understand it, you have to understand what an 18th century author of a recipe for a particular kind of government was trying to convey. That's just what communication is. That is why the correct way of interpreting, and again, emphasize, doesn't mean this is your guide to action. Correct way of interpreting the Constitution of the United States is the original intentions of the author. That's just what communication means. Two important things about that. Important thing number one about that does not make the enterprise of interpretation subjective, right? The world is what it is. Those are facts. How different people organize the world into conceptual schemes, those are facts, but they're not necessarily invariant facts. The way that someone in 1788 would have conceptually distinguished and then integrated things in the world is not necessarily the same as the way someone would do today. But if you want to understand what someone in 1788 was communicating, you need to understand their conceptual scheme. Now, Tara Smith is not here to defend herself, but she has a book coming out that I'm sure will do that task quite adequately. As I've explained in number 30 on the handout, she has a very long explanation for why she thinks a focus on original intentions misunderstands the nature of language. I beg to disagree. I think it's exactly the opposite. It is not the case that the meaning of words in an 18th century document are limited to the things, events, and relations that were concretely in the minds of an 18th century speaker. That would be to misunderstand the nature of concepts. But what's important here is not the concrete things that the person in that era had in mind, but the conceptual scheme that they had in mind. What are the criteria for inclusion within a concept? That is something that is not invariant across persons, across time. The things in the world are, the cognitive context is not, and therefore the concepts are not. If you want to understand what they were communicating, you need to understand their conceptual scheme, not yours, even if, and I emphasize this, even if yours is epistemologically and morally superior to theirs, right? Otherwise, you simply aren't communicating. Second thing that's very, very important to know, Once you have identified the meaning of the Constitution of the United States, it is easy to leap to the conclusion that, well, okay, that's law with all that follows. And I think Tara Smith is making that move. That's a conceptually separate move. I am not saying that it is a normatively good, I'm not saying it's not either, not commenting on that, but normatively good idea to follow the original intentions of the author of the 18th century document in terms of structuring the government. Just if you want to know what they were saying, now you got to figure out what they were saying. Nothing more complicated than that. Now, the last two things I want to say before I stop, there are two potential differences between the recipe for cheesecake and the recipe for government that we have before us. We don't know who wrote the recipe for cheesecake. Maybe it was a whole cooking group. It might have been 6 different people sitting down coming up with that recipe. Could be, don't know. We do know that that's pretty much how the Constitution was crafted. You had a delegation of 55 people, 39 of whom ended up signing the thing at the end. There was a large number of people who were not directly present at the convention, but whose presence and ideas were influential on the drafting process. There were 1,649 delegates at the various state ratifying conventions. A whole lot more people than that read it. And in terms of the actual language used, that was primarily the result of a committee of 5. Okay? So the Constitution was a jointly authored document. So when we're saying the intentions of the author of the recipe, well, who exactly is that author? And I can tell you, one of the things that prompted me to think about that very, very carefully was a lot of my work is co-authored. And one of my principal co-authors of the last 17 years is a law professor in Israel. And English is his second language. He's pretty good at it. He's gotten a lot better. In the early years, it was a little rough. When we are co-authoring products, what is it that they actually mean? It's not literally the way I would have done it if I didn't have a co-author. It's certainly not the way he would have done it if he didn't have a co-author. What we've really done is craft something that emerges from Lawson and Seidman. Now, Lawson and Seidman doesn't exist. All that exists in the world is Lawson here and Seidman there. And we each have our own minds. We each have our own intentions. And only individuals can have minds and intentions. There is no Lawson and Seidman group mind, and therefore, literally speaking, there is no Lawson and Seidman that can have intentions. And that's true of all groups. It's true of co-authors of scholarly articles. It's true of authors of the Constitution. So how do we figure out what the intentions are when there isn't a single mind to which you can attribute intentions? Well, think about this. Does it make sense in any way to talk about the intentions of John Galt or Howard Rourke or Dagny Taggart? I think the answer is yes. I actually think it's quite easy to talk about their intentions. They don't exist. They're fictional characters. But the fact that they're fictional characters doesn't mean that you can't postulate them as concrete entities, and from that postulation derive quite plausible, true and false propositions about their intentions. And I think much the same thing is true of groups. The joint authors do not literally, metaphysically, in some mystical fashion, create a new entity. But epistemologically, for purposes of understanding what as a joint enterprise they are communicating, it's quite possible to postulate a fictitious, but nonetheless understandable author to whom intentions can be presumed. And if you're really engaged in a serious joint enterprise, you sort of have to intend for that to happen. That is, your own individual concrete intention has to be to produce a product that isn't quite exactly going to be what you would produce on your own. So the way to understand an 18th century recipe, whether it's a recipe for potato cheesecake, whether it's a recipe for government expressed in the Constitution, is you kind of have to imagine a single author The characteristics of that single author are going to be determined by examining the work product, the context, what you know about the actual authors. But the end result may not be the particular thoughts that were in the head of any one single concrete author. Indeed, almost surely, in a joint enterprise involving lots of people, it won't be. So that's one potential difference between the Constitution and the potato cheesecake recipe. So we have to postulate an author for the Constitution. We may or may not have to do that with the cheesecake recipe. The second difference concerns what kind of recipe it is. There are recipes and there are recipes. It's actually not quite right to say the Constitution is a recipe for a particular kind of government. It is that, but it's something more than that. It also falls into a category of document that is distinct. It's legal. Now, whether or not it is binding on anyone, different question. For purposes of understanding the meaning, the thing that was attempted to be communicated by the people attempting to communicate, the fact that it's a legal instrument rather than some other kind of instrument matters. It matters for background conventions. You're not likely to be looking for similes and rhyme schemes. You are likely to be looking for technical legal terms that would be understood by people. So that affects the way it is. And although this would be an entirely separate talk, and I don't want to give it here, the Constitution even fits into a relatively narrow category of legal instruments, which you might call trust or fiduciary instruments. And as it happens, there is an entire background body of legal norms within the category of legal conventions. There are sub-legal conventions having to do with how you interpret trust or fiduciary instruments. And you can bring those to bear on understanding the Constitution of the United States. And I've given a little bit of the background on that in the handout as well. So how do you interpret the Constitution of the United States? You figure out what was intended by this hypothetical author who represents the joint efforts of a whole bunch of actual, literal, concrete authors, but probably doesn't reflect precisely what any one or small group of them had in mind, was trying to communicate. Understanding that you have to filter that through background conventions about ordinary language, communicative instruments, legal communicative instruments, fiduciary communicative instruments. What you do with that understanding, once you have it, that is not the document's fault, concern, or problem. Now, if I had an hour and 45 minutes instead of 45 minutes, I would explain how that is just the tip of the iceberg on what you need in order to interpret any document at all. It turns out that understanding anything, if you're making a proposition about what a document means, that's not in form different from a proposition about how certain molecules are going to behave under various laboratory conditions. Any such claim can be factually true or false, and there's going to be a process of proof, an epistemological process that is going to determine whether rational assent to that claim is warranted. That's true for interpretative propositions as much as it is true for scientific ones. The exact tools you will use, the precise cognitive standards are going to vary with the concept, with the context, but the formal structure of what it is you have to know and prove doesn't. But that's the subject of an entire book. Luckily for the world, it's coming out sometime this year. Unluckily for the world, and for me, it's going to be bought by 200 law libraries, and that's it. But there we go. All right, so that's the epistemological justification for an interpretative model of original intentions. With that, I will shush and see who wants to come to the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Gary, I think I get the idea of the epistemological aspect of the Constitution. But help me, if I were a justice, and for instance, the Second Amendment, I might conclude that the originators only meant guns to be part of a militia because we couldn't afford an armory and all that. But how would I take the entire Constitution's tenor, the whole flavor of our Constitution, couldn't I still conclude the right to own a gun for self-protection? And if I did that, I don't see how that fits in to what you're saying about those two aspects of the language.
Yeah, let me rephrase it more generally. Should public officials conduct their affairs in accordance with the actual meaning of the Constitution as opposed to something else? That is a hugely complicated question. Hugely complicated question. It is not a question that can be answered by tools of interpretative theory. It's a question that can only be answered by moral and political theory. Put this as bluntly as possible, it is not self-evident that the Constitution of the United States is binding on anyone, including people who swear oaths to uphold it. It may very well be. I actually think there's a pretty darn good, even if contextually contingent argument at the present state of history for that claim. But it's a very soft claim, it's very complicated, it turns on all sorts of things that law professors, qua law professors, have no expertise or business talking about, namely moral or political theory. We like to think of, a lot of my colleagues like to think of themselves as moral or political theorists. No, I'm not ducking the question. I mean, what do you do as a public official when the meaning of the Constitution is X and you think you can do better? Just like if you're a cook and you've got a recipe, you think you can make a better recipe. Do you make the better recipe or do you go with the original recipe?
But their job,
there are actually very good arguments both ways.
The job is to interpret the Constitution. So
well,
I don't know how we can do that and adapt it to modern times.
Well, if the answer is the job is to interpret the Constitution, if you've already decided that, that's why I said if you've already decided you're going to follow the recipe, then you follow the recipe. Here's the recipe. Here's what the recipe said. May not be a great recipe, maybe a really crappy recipe, but hey, I've already committed myself in some fashion to following the recipe, so here go the currants. Here comes the quarter pound of sugar. Man, this is going to be awful. There are all sorts of circumstances in which that is a perfectly reasonable, rational course of action. There are other circumstances in which it's not. I don't have a fully worked out moral/political theory about when one adheres to the Constitution. My instinct is that, yeah, there are all sorts of good reasons, particularly now, for adhering to that. If we were in a different context, a different setting, I can see the balance of forces coming out otherwise. So that's why I'm trying to draw this sharp distinction, and I've spent most of my academic career trying to draw it, between understanding what a document means and deciding whether or not that document is a normatively valid guide to action. As long as I can convince people that those are conceptually separate inquiries requiring different disciplines, different processes of thought, I'm going to declare victory and go home. So terrific, brilliant, exactly the right question. But this is not the talk that answers it.
I think one of the most abused phrases in the U.S. Constitution is the word regulate. Now, in my layperson's opinion, I think it means the medical definition. Now, if a person such as myself wanted to do research, which is outside this talk here, and find out were they meaning the medical definition or were they meaning what a lot of people today think about regulation, where would I begin, where would I hopefully end to say original intent in 1700s, 18th century, what that word meant?
No, it's exactly, I mean, one place where it shows up, obviously, is the preamble of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being essential to a free society. Shows up in Article 1 as well. Congress has power to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. I think it is virtually certain that the word regulate, as used by an ordinary 18th century speaker in a legal document, and trust-like legal document, would not be the ordinary meaning that would come out of, let's say, the Environmental Protection Agency today. I think that's absolutely clear. Yeah. That's why I say it's important in understanding the things, events, and relations in the world to which a document refers to understand the conceptual scheme of the author. You would have to figure out this hypothetical author of this document, who we can assume represents, we can assume it because I have a whole 40-page article explaining why you can assume this, was a highly educated hypothetical person, learned in the law, hypothetical person, familiar with trust instruments, hypothetical person. How would that person, in the cognitive context in which they were located, not this one, but that one, organize the world? How would they distinguish certain kinds of events and relations from others? What integrations would they then make as a way of organizing their cognitive world? What perceptual concretes would they then use to identify those integrations of different parts of the world? That is why understanding an 18th century document requires a fair amount of understanding of 18th century linguistics, history, psychology, all sorts of disciplines that are the handmaidens of any kind of intelligent interpretation. That is one of the reasons why I mostly confine myself to the abstract principles, because I'm not an historian, I'm not a linguist, I'm not a psychologist, I don't want to be any of those things. And actually, to get some of these questions right, you have to be all of those things. Some of them you don't. Some of them you can get really, really easy ones. It just so happens, because I've come across this in some of my other scholarship, regulate, particularly as it appears in the provision dealing with the military, is actually a tricky one. It's actually not self-evidently obvious on casual investigation. So you would have to go into what the 18th century conceptual schema was like. I mean, if suppose you're dealing with someone whose English is their third language, how are you going to understand what they're referring to? It's very difficult. You can sometimes do it, sometimes you can make decent approximations, but it's tough. And if you're far enough removed in time from someone who's got a very different conceptual scheme from yours, the fact that they're using the same language in some sense lowers that distance, but there's still going to be a distance. So regulate actually turns out to be a tricky case, at least from the limited investigations that I've made into it. But that's what you'd have to do. That's the kind of inquiry you'd have to make. Professor.
Yes. In the modern debate, this is a very friendly question.
Oh, okay.
In the modern debate over originalism, many scholars, among them Randy Barnett, have argued for what they call the original public meaning of the Constitution. And my question is, how does that compare to your notion of the meaning of a hypothetical single author? And maybe to make it more concrete, where, for example, how would you rank the Federalist Papers as a kind of an authoritative source of that meaning? How important are the Federalist Papers in determining that meaning?
Okay, first question. Very close. I actually, in print any number of times, have described what I do as describing original public meaning. Small boast, Larry Solem, a leading scholar, has actually credited me with introducing the idea of original public meaning into legal discourse. It surprises me, but back in 1992, he credits me with that. When you're figuring out what a hypothetical author had in mind, since that author was obviously communicating to a broad public audience, of course, the intention of that author would be to have their utterances understood as they would be by a large segment of the informed public. So, if you will, the authorial intention is to have their utterances understood as they would be by the public. So, as an operational matter, I think what you're going to end up with is exactly what Randy ends up with, which is original public meaning. I just think the theoretical grounding for that lies in this notion of intention. So as an operational matter, yes, this is going to turn out to be 99.99% the original public meaning. The 0.01% comes from the fact that this is a fiduciary or trust instrument, and there are certain technical terms that might not be understood by the ordinary public, but which have a technical meaning within the law of fiduciaries and trusts. And in that context, you'd go with the conventional meaning rather than the ordinary public meaning. But 99.9% it's going to be public meaning. Where the Federalist Papers come in, same place any other newspaper editorial or political propaganda would come in. It's a piece of information. It would, in legalese, be admissible. Wouldn't be excluded as inadmissible. How much is it going to count? Probably not a whole heaping lot. But as much as any, it's one piece of evidence about how certain members of the public understood these things. But no more than that, no more, no less than a newspaper editorial in Pennsylvania complaining about monarchism or looming tyranny or anything else. So not a whole lot.
We have a few more minutes. Any other questions? If not, I will ask the final question.
Yes. Should I hide?
Okay. Guess I'll use it by mic. Hi. My question concerns a specific part of the Constitution, specifically the Ninth Amendment, which, one of my favorites too, which says the enumeration of
enumeration in this Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people.
Yes, an excellent one. We like to say that conservatives tend to like, original, except for that one, and then anyway. But my question concerns that sort of, it seems to be an amendment that defines the nature of the document. It's a document of limited and enumerated powers. The assumption of the whole document, if you take the Ninth Amendment seriously, is that it is a document of limited and enumerated powers, that I don't have to find a right. The government has to find a power to do something.
Yep.
And that over time, that is one part of the recipe, so to speak, that is foundational to the document, and yet is pretty much ignored, I think, unfortunately, by left and right anymore these days. Any thoughts about that in terms of your discussion?
Yeah, suppose I hire an agent in 1788 to go to France to sell cannon for me from my cannon factory. There's going to be a document that authorizes that agent in France to do certain things on my behalf, to contract for the sale of cannon, maybe to extend sales on credit. There are going to be some background rules, actually, about what those agents can and can't do that I don't have to specify. I don't have to say that the agent can't sell my entire company out from under me. That's just part of the... You could imagine a legal world in which that was true, and you'd have to rule that out. There are certain background rules. But what that agency instrument's going to do is authorize that agent to do certain things. Now, having authorized the agent to do certain things, I don't then need to list all the 17 billion things in the world that the agent can't do. Because the agent started out with nothing, started out as a nobody. I have now conferred certain authority on that agent to do the things that the agency instrument specifies, and those things that are carried as a matter of convention with ordinary agency instruments. Well, if the Constitution really is an agency instrument of this sort, and I think it quite clearly is, but that would be a separate talk, well, then of course that's where the principle of limited powers comes from. You have authorized this entity to do certain things. You don't need to list all of the things that the entity can't do. That's just not how agency instruments work. This particular agency instrument does, as it happens, list some things, both in the original document and in the first 8 amendments, that this entity can't do. To avoid misunderstanding the nature of the instrument, as something other than an agency instrument, the Ninth Amendment clarifies, don't get this wrong, it's still an enumeration of powers for an agent and nothing more. The fact that we've thrown these things in for extra caution, as one of the early drafts of the Ninth Amendment specifically used that phrase, for caution, shouldn't change the basic analysis. So I actually think the Ninth Amendment is a very easy provision to understand. It says, don't misunderstand the nature of this document. Don't reason that just because you can't find, just like you can't find one of the 17 billion things that your factor in France selling cannons can't do, doesn't mean they can do it. Doesn't mean they can sell your house. Doesn't mean they can, mortgage your farm or, pledge your firstborn daughter to the King of France. No, you don't need to say that. They're there to sell cannons. Well, this government, it's here to post office and weights and measures and commerce among the several states. That's what it's for. That's what the Ninth Amendment is.
Okay. So in other words, you would be in favor of another amendment that says the Ninth Amendment, we really mean it, take it seriously. So,
yeah, that would be useful.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway.
Yeah, but then you'd have to. The problem is then you need another amendment and another.
I know.
Amendment,
I'd go for the ninth
amendment to get the amendment.
I do the 9th and the 10th just to be clear. But anyway, okay. And if there's no further question, I think we're out of time. Thank you very much. And we have he'll be here tomorrow same time, same place for another talk. So
yes.
Thanks. You want to add a line while we change things?
Yeah. I'm not going anywhere.
You mentioned poetry a lot of times, and I sometimes throw some around. So I just came up with the Constitution, like potato cheesecake, works better when done right. That's a hike.
All right. Yeah.